U.S. District Judge Edward Weinfeld later reduced bail to $500,000 and scheduled March 8th to hear a defense motion to separate Eric Wilson's trial. PLO also, whose activities invariably rebound to the discredit of the left, the Munich massacre of 1972 being a primary example, Carlos the Jackal being involved in that. Yet the people they seem to be bringing into these groups or getting involved with these groups all seem to be, first of all, his family members, military activists who've all worked for the CIA or are working for the CIA or various other American intelligence groups. And second of all, when the trail begins to come to light, we notice this series of deaths beginning. And as you will notice, there are an entire series. Okay, Wilson was indicted for these so-called attempts at assassination, but in fact, people who were directly involved with the Wilson case we'll find up cropping up dead in large numbers, every single one of them found to be dead not for having anything to do with the Wilson case, but invariably for something else.
And also keep in mind the assassination of Orlando Letelier, because we're going to come back to that later in the program. So, Quintero is on Wilson's list. Wilson supposedly is prevented from knocking these people off, but one of Quintero's buddies, Rafael Villaverde, drops dead. Under very strange circumstances, his boat explodes, and he's no more to be found.
Okay. Another interesting case, a man by the name of Ricardo Morales, otherwise known as Monkey Morales. We're going to talk about him in a moment. This article is from the San Francisco Chronicle from March 13th, 1983. It's headlined, "The Barroom Death of a Shadowy Legend." The man they're talking about is, as I mentioned before, Ricardo Morales, otherwise known as Monkey Morales. And he is shot dead in a bar. I should just briefly tell you, because we're not going to read the whole article. He's shot dead in a bar by apparently a patron of the bar. The police find that it was all on the up and up, do not even press charges. Supposedly, Morales had gotten into an argument with his bar patron over something that he thought the bar patron had said, according to the police. Okay, reading from the article, it's by Edward Cody from the Washington Post originally. Morales also was the chief informer for Miami police last year in an elaborate drug investigation called Operation Tick-Tocks because of a bug hidden behind a clock in a suspect's home. Briefly, I will mention that was, of course, the operation Dave was speaking of in the last article that he was reading as regards the Villaverde brothers and Rafael Quintero. The case was eventually thrown out of court because a judge ruled that Morales lacked credibility, but not before Rafael Villaverde and his brother Raul were charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Friends say Morales had long wanted to nail Rafael Villaverde, a fellow Cuban. Villaverde, a Bay of Pigs veteran, had been a CIA operative in Miami during the agency's Cuban destabilization campaign in the early 1960s. Morales' friends say they did not know why Morales had it in for him, meaning Villaverde, but Morales also was a CIA operative in the anti-Cuban campaign and a friend of former CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson. As a young CIA officer, Wilson had participated in the anti-Cuba campaign for which Miami was the chief launching pad. Anti-Cuban campaign veterans Rafael and Raul Villaverde had said they met Wilson in Geneva in September 1976 because they thought Wilson was recruiting them for a CIA plan to kill an international terrorist called Carlos the Jackal. But by then, Wilson was working for Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. According to U.S. investigators, he was proposing instead a plot to kill a Libyan dissident. The Villaverdes went to the U.S. authorities with the proposal. Their denunciation became part of an investigation that has landed Wilson in jail. Okay, so Ricardo Monkey Morales, a former member of the Cuban exile movement working for the CIA as a CIA agent, along with Rafael Villaverde, who, according to this article, joined Operation Tick-Tocks to get a hold of Villaverde and to nail him. But apparently, well, we don't know if that was the case or not. We do know Villaverde apparently blew up, or anyway disappeared when his boat blew up, and a short while later, Ricardo Morales is shot dead in a bar in Miami.
Okay, now keep in mind that, again, Morales is a friend of Ed Wilson's. He doesn't like Rafael Villaverde for some reason. He doesn't like Rafael Villaverde for some reason, and so he gets Rafael Villaverde involved in a drug bust. Okay, and Rafael Villaverde then, after that drug bust, disappears in a boat explosion, and after that, this friend of Ed Wilson's, Monkey Morales, dies in a bar fight because someone called him a homosexual, and this veteran CIA agent and mercenary couldn't stand that insult, and so got involved in a life-ending argument.
Oh, by the way, I just wanted to mention that he was shot in the back of the head with a .32 caliber bullet, which is an interesting way to get it in a bar fight.
Right, so keep in mind the end of Monkey Morales. Now, again, these are just two people that have cropped up in connection with the Wilson case who died unnatural deaths. I'm going to read you about another one. Research credit for this article also goes to Ted Rubenstein, who's been working with us here for some time. Following story Ted got from the Winston-Salem, North Carolina Journal from August 30th of 1982. Again, the Winston-Salem Journal, 8/30/82. This is an AP story, dateline Fayetteville. It's headlined, Death of Soldier of Fortune is Puzzling. The death last March of William Russell Cranford, a former Fayetteville police investigator and a globe-trotting soldier of fortune, poses nearly as many questions as his tumultuous life, police say. Police say Cranford shot himself in the head in his small mobile home in Fayetteville, but they admit the death was unusual. An autopsy showed Cranford had been shot twice in the left temple with a .22 caliber revolver. A pathologist attributed the second shot to a muscle contraction, but police say they have never seen such a case except with an automatic. Interrupting here again, this was a revolver, not an automatic. An X-ray of Cranford's skull also showed a third bullet. Police said that bullet came from an attempted suicide in September of 1979 when Cranford shot himself in the temple while sitting in a dimly lit Fayetteville bar. That attempted suicide left him partially paralyzed on his right side. Cranford's body was found with a revolver between his feet, police said. Investigators also found a beer can and a TV guide, each with a bullet hole on an end table. 2 teeth were on the table near the beer can. A pathologist said the teeth were Cranford's. According to Sergeant Jimmy Cook, chief investigator, but he did not say how they were taken out. Skipping down in the article. One federal agent said recently, "We are no longer interested in Cranford. If he were still alive, we'd be interested." Again, referring to alcohol, tobacco, firearms investigations of William Russell Cranford. Reading that sentence again. One federal agent said recently, "We are no longer interested in Cranford. If he were still alive, we would be interested." Skipping down still further in the article. Cranford spent 20 years in the Army, mostly in Special Forces. He was an intelligence analyst in Vietnam from August of 1963 until February of 1966, from September 66 through August 67, and from July 68 until July 69. He retired from the Army in May of 1973 and joined the Fayetteville Police Department, where he worked in intelligence until he resigned in 1975. Following his resignation, the first verifiable activity was Cranford's involvement with former CIA agent Edwin Wilson in his alleged dealings with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Dick Peterson, an ATF agent in Falls Church, Virginia, who worked on the Wilson case, says Cranford's name surfaced several times in the Wilson investigation in 1977 and 78. Peterson says Cranford wasn't very high up in the organization. Quote, "He was a grunt, one of the former Special Forces soldiers who were hired to do a job," Peterson said last week. Wilson, whose organization made him a multimillionaire, is now in federal custody awaiting trial on 1980 indictments charging him and former CIA agent Frank Terpil with supplying Gaddafi with explosives, setting up a school to train terrorists in Libya, and conspiring to commit an assassination for Gaddafi. So, again, another former Special Forces soldier working for Terpil and Wilson dies under strange circumstances. A 2-bullet suicide with a revolver, which police say they have never heard of, given the fact that this was not an automatic, the fact that a beer can and a TV guide had a bullet hole through them, the fact that 2 of his teeth were knocked out, and well, make of that what you will. Again, yet another violent death in connection with the Wilson case, and just again, a former Wilson a Wilson recruitee has exited the hard way here. And again, keep in mind the list of people that Wilson was going to knock off, and the fact that while Wilson was in jail, it would not have been easy for him to pull these things off on his own, if indeed it was Wilson who did this. But again, Wilson's on ice. His plot has been foiled, but look at all the people that are starting to drop dead in connection with the case.
That's right. 3 so far. Villaverde's boat blows up. Monkey Morales takes a bullet in the back of the head in a bar fight, and Cranford shoots himself twice in the head with a revolver. Go figure. Okay, on to the next. And this is beginning to seem a little morbid. It gets worse. Okay, this is the San Francisco Chronicle for Thursday, October 28th, 1982. It's headlined, "Ex-CIA Agent Feared for His Life," cop says. And you've heard the name of this gentleman before. A Colorado policeman said yesterday that former CIA analyst Kevin Mulcahy called him a week and a half ago and said he was being followed from one motel room to another. The FBI is investigating the mysterious death of Mulcahy, age 40. An autopsy did not immediately pinpoint the cause of his death at the cabin of a remote motel in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Further tests, including those for poison, were ordered. A spokesman at FBI headquarters said a preliminary investigation would be conducted by the Bureau's Richmond, Virginia office. Shenandoah County authorities also said they would investigate, pending a final autopsy finding. Colorado officer Ray Martinez said of Mulcahy yesterday, quote, "He's been in rooms and knows that when he's been out of the room, somebody's been in his room. He didn't know, in his words, if there's a bomb being planted or somebody was setting him up, or if he's going to be poisoned. He'd expressed that several times, that he thought he could be poisoned to death," the officer told CBS News. Additionally, a former Green Beret who worked for the CIA said he is convinced that Mulcahy was killed to stop him from testifying against a renegade ex-intelligence agent accused of arming Libyan terrorists. Mulcahy's body was found Tuesday morning jackknifed in the cabin doorway. They don't mean with a knife in him, they mean bent over in the cabin doorway. A window had been shattered by a shotgun. Quote, "Immediately I knew that he was killed to keep from testifying," former Green Beret Luke Thompson told CBS News. He said he had met Mulcahy on several occasions and that he had been recruited by Edwin Wilson to train commandos in Libya. Mulcahy, a communications expert who left the CIA in 1968, was the second potential prosecution witness to die in the case of Wilson, an ex-CIA agent accused of working for Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. He was scheduled to testify against Wilson next month. Quote, "Probably drugs," said Thompson, speculating on the cause of death. "Probably simulated a heart attack. There's a number of ways, but that's probably the most common. The drug is not traceable an hour or so after death," unquote. Thompson said he fears for his own life now. Quote, "I'm trying to stay away from my home as much as possible," he said, adding that he has not been offered federal protection. Quote, "I don't want my family involved." Mulcahy was scheduled to be a key witness at the first of 3 separate trials of Wilson scheduled to begin next month in Alexandria, Virginia, Washington, and Houston. Assistant U.S. Attorney E. Lawrence Barcella, the prosecutor in charge of the Wilson case, said the death would not cause any delays. Mulcahy is said to have joined up with Wilson and another former CIA employee, Frank Terpil, in 1976, then become disillusioned and told the CIA what he knew about the operation. Wilson and Terpil, who was last reported as a fugitive in Beirut, were allegedly involved in an operation that smuggled arms, explosives, and trick bombs into Libya. Rafael Villaverde, a Cuban also allegedly involved in the Wilson case, was killed in a boat explosion near the Bahamas 7 months ago. The Coast Guard ruled it an accident. Okay, a couple of things to mention real quickly. First of all, I'd like to... we will be taking a break in a couple of minutes. First of all, you notice in the article they say the second death of a key witness. Well, we're doing this in chronological order. So, in fact, this is the 4th death of a witness or a potential witness in the case, as we have mentioned, and we have listed the other 3 for you. Now, remember from earlier in the show when we told you that Mulcahy, many years back before his death, had been probably the first person that's been reported as blowing the whistle on Ed Wilson, reporting, in fact, that he'd been on a yacht party or a boat party with Ed Wilson and Carlos the Jackal, among other people, and that although numerous investigations were started at Mulcahy's request, Wilson was never arrested for anything for 4 years. Now, Kevin Mulcahy, who feared for his life, is found dead of mysterious causes. Luke Thompson suggests that perhaps he was given a drug that would simulate a heart attack, which disappears about an hour after death. I should mention, too, since I don't think we follow up on it in this article, that was the eventual finding was natural causes. Mulcahy found, as I recall, half naked and jackknifed in his doorway and with a shotgun blast having blown out the window of the cabin he was staying in.
With his pants down around his ankles.
Pants down around his ankles, yes. Was found dead of natural causes from exposure. Well, that would do it.
And one of his cohorts in the Terpil Wilson operation, Mr. Thompson, now fears for his life, and I don't think he's afraid of catching AIDS.
No, that's right. And I don't think he's afraid of freezing to death with his pants down around his ankles either.
No, indeed.
Not intentionally. Yeah.
No, indeed. So keep in mind the fact that Mulcahy not only broke the Terpil Wilson case, but remember also that Mulcahy, as Nip mentioned, was testified that he was on a yacht on a party with Terpil and Carlos the Jackal, among others. And, of course, Terpil has boasted that he trained Carlos. More about the Mulcahy killing. This from the San Jose News of Friday, October 29th of 1982. Remember, too, that Mulcahy died something like 4 days before the start of Wilson's trial. It said next month, but this was at the end of October, and the trial was due to start in early November. San Jose News entitled this, Congressman Gore fears CIA tipster was murdered. It's well, it doesn't say what the wire service is. Anyway, it's Dateline, Washington. Again, Congressman Gore fears CIA tipster was murdered. Investigators increasingly believe ex-CIA analyst Kevin Mulcahy died of natural causes, but a congressman active in a House panel investigation of alleged arms and terrorist dealings in Libya by former CIA agents said he believes Mulcahy was murdered. The 40-year-old Mulcahy, who was to have been a prosecution witness against ex-CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson, was found dead outside a motel cabin door in rural Virginia, 90 miles west of here, on Tuesday morning. My gut feeling is he was murdered, said Representative Albert Gore, Jr., Democrat of Tennessee, who was a member of the House Intelligence Committee this year, intensively interviewed Mulcahy, the man who first tipped the CIA to Wilson's activities in Libya. He's the second prospective witness for pending criminal trials to meet with death, Gore reasoned. That's too much of a coincidence for me to buy. More than that, Gore said, Mulcahy recently indicated in telephone conversations with law officers that he felt he was being followed motel to motel, unquote, and that people had broken into his room before he was found dead Tuesday at a motel in rural Shenandoah, Virginia. Shenandoah County Prosecutor William H. Logan, Jr. said Thursday that agents had not yet located two middle-aged women who visited Mulcahy's motel cabin on October 21st, the day after he checked in. But Logan said they now believed the pair was not visiting Mulcahy, but rather inspecting the cabin as a place they might want to rent, unquote. Skipping down further in the article, a major part of the panel's probe focuses on whether agents who are still with the CIA were involved with Terpil and Wilson or knew of their alleged operations or similar operations. Gore said he and other panel members were privately briefed on Mulcahy's death by the panel staff even before police released the news to the press. He said he didn't know how the staff learned of the death so quickly, but he noted that the Intelligence Committee is following the case very closely. The congressman declined to speculate on who might have murdered Mulcahy, but he added, quote, Wilson has associates in his netherworld that are fully capable of doing such a thing, unquote. Interesting to note here that the House panel that's investigating this was taking a look as to whether or not the active CIA personnel were involved with Terpil and Wilson. Again, keep in mind that House panel. We're going to touch on that later in the article. So at least one congressman feels that Mulcahy was murdered, even though the eventual results said natural causes. Okay, so again, more perspective on the Mulcahy death.
All right, and also bear in mind that in our running tally here, this is sort of like the Jerry Lewis telephone. That makes 4 witnesses dead all of them at least of somewhat suspicious causes. Okay, we're going to pass along here to another story, and you will see, I'm sure you've figured out the general tenor of what's going on here by now. This is from the San Jose Mercury News for April 30th, 1983, and the headline is, guess what? Suspected spy dead in apparent suicide. This is a Washington Post wire story. A retired high-level Pentagon intelligence analyst was found dead Friday of an apparently self-inflicted shotgun blast, 5 hours after he was to be arraigned on charges that he had sold U.S. military secrets to Libya through ex-CIA agent, guess who, Edwin P. Wilson. Police in Arlington, Virginia, said the body of Waldo H. Duberstein, spelled D-U-B-B-E-R-S-T-E-I-N, age 75, who was indicted by a federal grand jury Thursday, was found about 2 p.m. on a chair in a basement storage area in his apartment building in Rosslyn, Virginia. A 12-gauge shotgun was near his body, and police spokesman Tom Bell said Duberstein had been shot once in the head. A law enforcement source said Friday night that 4 notes in Duberstein's handwriting had been found, but declined to reveal the contents. The source said 1 note was addressed to Duberstein's lawyers, 1 to his estranged wife, and 1 to a 32-year-old German-born woman who had lived with him at the apartment. The source did not know to whom the 4th note was addressed. The FBI had begun searching for Duberstein about 11 a.m., 2 hours after the career analyst failed to appear for his arraignment in Alexandria. District Judge Albert V. Bryan, Jr., accepting the arguments of prosecutors who feared Duberstein had fled the area, issued a warrant for his arrest. Prosecutors and defense lawyers said they had been told, and it doesn't say by whom, Duberstein had left his apartment overlooking the Potomac River about 8 a.m., headed for court. Skipping down, Bell said police were called shortly after 2 p.m. by an unidentified man and asked to, quote, check on the welfare of a person at the complex. Officers who went to the scene were led to the storage room by a tenant. Duberstein joined the CIA at its inception in 1947 and later served as a top Middle East expert for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He and his wife of 41 years had been separated for several years, according to a woman who answered the telephone at the home of Duberstein's wife in Alexandria. Law enforcement sources said Duberstein had been living with Renata Strelau, S-T-R-E-L-A-U, a naturalized American who had worked in Washington for the Iranian embassy during the Shah's reign. Assistant U.S. Attorney Theodore S. Greenberg, who had pressed the case against Duberstein and had told Bryan that the former analyst had a motive and sufficient money to flee, went to the apartment building shortly after the body had been discovered. Greenberg emerged grim-faced 30 minutes later and refused to discuss the death's impact on the continuing government investigation of Wilson and his dealings. The case against Duberstein, who was allowed to remain on the government payroll long after his normal retirement because of his expertise, contained the first formal allegations that Wilson's dealing with Libya had involved secrets from the top levels of the government's intelligence agencies. Okay, let me just underline a couple of points real quickly. Okay, first of all, apparently Duberstein, another important witness, turns up dead, apparent suicide, in the home of his, apparently a girlfriend, or at least a woman that had lived with him at his apartment. Turns up a woman who had worked in, a German-born woman who had worked in Washington for the Iranian embassy during the reign of the Shah. And also, because Duberstein, also significant is the fact that Duberstein, according to this article, his prosecution against him contained the first formal allegations that Wilson's dealings with Libya had involved the top levels of the government's intelligence agencies. And a little later in the broadcast, we'll talk in a little more detail just what kind of things exactly that Duberstein was involved with. But that's number 5, folks. Waldo Duberstein, dead of an apparent suicide.
And again, the Edwin Wilson is in jail. Supposedly, his plot to assassinate all these people was foiled. If so, who's doing all the killing? And again, we have Rafael Villaverde dies in a boat explosion. Monkey Morales killed allegedly in a bar fight, shot in the back of the head. William Russell Cranford, alleged suicide, shot twice in the temple with a revolver, which is interesting. And we have Kevin Mulcahy, allegedly dead of natural causes. And we have Waldo Duberstein, ruled a suicide, dies of a shotgun blast to the head. Okay, again, a note to how soon both Mulcahy and Duberstein were to go to court. Mulcahy within a few days, Duberstein within a few hours in connection with the Terpil Wilson case. Well, one hint as to who may have been doing these killings, if, as we're to believe, Edwin Wilson is on ice, is contained in one of the articles about the death of Kevin Mulcahy. Following story appeared in the San Jose Mercury on Wednesday, October 27th of 1982. It's datelined Washington and headlined, "Ex-CIA agent who blew whistle on Wilson and Terpil found dead." I'm just going to read a small section of this article. In an interview with the Mercury last February, Mulcahy complained of widespread corruption in Washington and predicted that the Wilson and Terpil prosecution would never reach a courtroom. They, federal officials, are hoping it's going to die a slow death, he claimed. Wilson and Terpil will never see a courtroom, Mulcahy said, claiming that, quote, Ed Wilson has threatened to close the gates of CIA front and back if he ever sees a court of law, unquote. He could put the finger on so many highly placed people that partied and hunted on his farm in Virginia, Mulcahy said. Mulcahy complained that illegal arms shipments from the U.S. to hostile countries such as Libya involved well-placed Washington middlemen. Somewhere in every one of these operations, the strings all lead back to a guy in Washington who made it possible, unquote, he said. Okay, so, at this point, we're going to let you ponder what we've presented so far, and we're going to come back and we're going to show you some of these strings and some of these highly placed people to whom they go in the next portion of the broadcast. But this is one hint as to what may be accounting for the strange and untimely deaths of all these people in the Wilson-Terpil case.
That's indeed true. Five dead witnesses, and none of whom, when we consider that the allegation that Wilson is the person hiring hitmen, virtually all the people killed of these five witnesses that we've just described to you were people who would have been capable of affirming Wilson's claim that he was in fact working on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency. Virtually all these people were familiar with his contacts clear up into the high levels of America's intelligence agencies. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we return with the next section of the broadcast. Don't go away. We're going to take a short musical break and stretch our legs. You can stretch your legs too. We'll be back. We're ready to continue with the second section of Radio Free America, the strange case of Messrs. Terpil and Wilson. And we hope you've been keeping up with us so far. This has been, believe it or not, pretty simple stuff so far, pretty cut and dried, people putting 2 revolver bullets into their head and things like that. Things that even Miss Nancy from Romper Room, or Miss Nancy from Reagan Room, actually, could probably figure out if they tried. We're going to start getting a little more closely into the complicated world of international espionage and arms and guns and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And again, if you have any problems with following some of this stuff, we hope you're taping, because then you can always go back and listen to it. But also we intend, time permitting, to have a phone segment at the end of the show, and you can call up and ask us any questions you might have.
Now, remember what we left off with before the break. Remember how Kevin Mulcahy, the late Kevin Mulcahy, he of the man who broke Terpil and Wilson's case, and who also testified that he saw Frank and Carlos the Jackal and some others at a party in the River Thames, that he said that all of these operations involve very powerful middlemen in Washington, and that he predicted that the case would never see a courtroom, because basically that if you follow this, as he put it, if you follow the strings of these operations, everyone goes back to a very highly placed individual in Washington, and that's where we're going to pick up at this point.
Yes, it might be mentioned that the case did see a courtroom. However, the courtroom that it saw was missing, as we mentioned, at least 4 or 5 rather important witnesses, linking Wilson and his claims of intelligence backing to the very top of the clandestine intelligence framework of the United States.
Recall that Wilson's defense was that he was working for the U.S. government and that he was being left out in the cold.
Okay, this next article is from the San Jose Mercury for Wednesday, November 3rd, 1982. It's headlined, Wilson Lawyer Casts Wide Net in Witness List. This is a UPI Wire story, dateline Washington. The lawyer for Edwin Wilson, a renegade CIA agent accused of helping Libyan terrorists, said Tuesday his client has drawn up a witness roster for his trial, a wish list that reads like a who's who of world affairs. Included on the list, filed late Monday with a federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, are Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Vice President George Bush, an intelligence community, and AFL and CIO officials, lawyer John Keats said. U.S. District Court Judge Orrin Lewis will decide which, if any, top military officials and persons of cabinet or ambassadorial rank will have to testify. He also will decide what classified documents will be permitted at the trial. Wilson goes on trial in Alexandria November 15th, one of 3 trials he faces on charges involving the shipment of weapons to Libya. One of the weapons involved allegedly was used in the assassination of a Libyan dissident in Bonn. The former CIA agent has been indicted along with associate Frank Terpil on a variety of charges involving arms and explosive shipments to Libya and arranging terrorist training. Wilson, age 54, recently was lured out of exile. Terpil remains a fugitive and was last reported in Beirut. Wilson's attorneys also filed a list of documents they want, most from the CIA and the armed forces, but also some from the AFL-CIO. The government submitted its list of requested documents in a sealed envelope. In addition to Bush, who once ran the CIA, and Mubarak, Wilson's lawyers also said they want testimony from Admiral Bobby Inman, former deputy CIA director and former head of the super-secret National Security Agency, Major General Richard Secord, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, AFL-CIO officials, including President Lane Kirkland, several CIA figures, and Egypt's Assistant Military Attaché in Washington. CIA documents sought include all items on Wilson's collection of intelligence information in Libya, the Middle East, and elsewhere, the, quote, book cable on Wilson sent to all CIA stations in 1976 and 77 after he left the CIA, and information on the Glomar Explorer, a vessel involved in an attempt to salvage a sunken Soviet submarine in the Pacific. The lawyers said they want the AFL-CIO to provide data on labor problems and what they described as Wilson's cooperation and work with the labor group concerning CIA operations. They also sought from several agencies any documents on Wilson's relationship with an intelligence operation known as Task Force 157, a secret Navy unit that monitored Soviet shipping and helped get Taiwanese agents into China. The operation ended after Richard Nixon's 1972 visit to Peking. Okay, now a couple of things to look at here. Well, quite a few things, actually. Who exactly Wilson has picked on to call in, and even though most of these people would never come in to court, never be a chance in the world that these people would actually come into court and testify in a case like this, it could perhaps be suggested that, in fact, Wilson was talking in code to the people who know about what he knew, and this is, in fact, what his list of witnesses was meant to signify. Hosni Mubarak is significant for, obviously, the reason that he was the successor to Anwar Sadat, and, in fact, was on the reviewing stand next to Anwar Sadat when Anwar Sadat was assassinated. We may talk a little bit more about that later, time permitting. Some of the other interesting things, of course, Bobby Inman, not only former CIA director, deputy director, and head of the NSA, but Bobby Inman was also originally out of Naval Intelligence, which is something that Wilson worked with quite a bit, as we have seen earlier, and we will find out more when we talk about Task Force 157. Major General Richard Secord is going to be significant in light of his position as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs when we talk about the Nugan Bank a little bit later in the show. And AFL-CIO officials, including Lane and Kirkland, will also mention in terms of Wilson's connections to the labor movement. So a variety of things to keep one's ear open for, and we will be handling them as we move along. Okay, now, a great many names, and keep in mind, particularly the Hosni Mubarak reference that Nip Tuck made just there, just a second ago, because now Hosni Mubarak is not only the
current president of Egypt and was standing right next to his predecessor, Anwar Sadat, when he became the ex-president in a hail of bullets. But in addition, basically, Anwar Sadat was involved with, of course, negotiating the Camp David agreements. And among the provisions made in the Camp David agreements was for a very large arms transaction between the United States and Egypt. And Edwin Wilson's name crops up in connection with this. And also a fellow by the name of Thomas G. Kleins. Now, this is significant because Kleins is one of the many powerful men in Washington to whom these threads that Kevin Mulcahy alluded to run. Thomas G. Kleins was in charge of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. I've forgotten what his exact title was, but he was basically running covert operations for the CIA. I believe he was the director of clandestine services, but I could be wrong about the exact title. Anyway, Thomas Kleins, running covert operations for CIA, was involved with Edwin Wilson in a number of the corporate fronts that Wilson set up to do his work, and in particular was involved with the Camp David Accords arms transaction. The following story appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on Tuesday, January 17th of 1984. This is an AP story, Dateline Washington, headlined, Ex-CIA Officer Pleads Guilty in Arms Case. A former top-level CIA clandestine services officer pleaded guilty yesterday on behalf of his firm to inflating bills submitted to the Defense Department for shipping U.S. military equipment to Egypt. As a part of a plea bargain with the government, the former CIA man, Thomas G. Kleins, C-L-I-N-E-S, was fined a maximum of $10,000 and paid the government $100,000 on behalf of his firm to settle all civil claims for the overbilling. The firm, Systems Services International, was wholly owned by Kleins. The Justice Department announced that the proceeding occurred before U.S. District Judge Richard Williams in Richmond, Virginia. Kleins' plea to filing false invoices to the Defense Security Assistance Agency marks the third guilty plea that the Justice Department has obtained in its long-running investigation of the contract. The contract involved more than $5.6 billion in military equipment and services, including jet fighters, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and spare parts, shipped from the United States to Egypt after the Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt during the Carter administration. Assistant U.S. Attorney Theodore Greenberg said the payment by Kleins on behalf of his now-defunct firm, quote, resolves the fraud aspects of the case, unquote. But Greenberg said other matters are still under investigation. It has been learned that the other matters involve allegations of a bribery conspiracy to obtain the exclusive multi-million-dollar contract for shipping the military goods to Egypt. These allegations involve ex-CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson, who already has been convicted of illegally smuggling explosives and weapons to Libya and of conspiring from federal prison to murder the prosecutors in his case and witnesses against him. The government's plea bargain with Kleins, which was filed in federal court, left the government free to prosecute him for other aspects of the Egyptian deal. The agreement stated that although the government has no intention of prosecuting Kleins, he has been advised that he will be called before the grand jury. There was no agreement for Kleins to cooperate with the continuing government investigation, however. So, again, Thomas Kleins is Director of Covert Operations for the CIA, and he is among the people involved with Edwin Wilson, not only in his many corporate fronts, but apparently in a bribery conspiracy to obtain the very lucrative arms contracts that were going from the United States to Egypt. Okay, again, Director of Covert Operations for the CIA, one of a number of very important people who are going to crop up in connection with Edwin Wilson.
All right. Now, in this next article, we're going to see a couple of things. Well, let me read the article first to you, and then I'll point them out. This is a Jack Anderson column from the San Francisco Chronicle for Monday, June 28, 1982. It's headlined Ace in the Hole. It starts out like this. Ed Wilson, the renegade CIA agent who was lured into a trap by the Justice Department, has an ace in the hole. His testimony. Consider the embarrassment he could cause by testifying about just 2 episodes at a public trial. 1. Wilson was on the CIA's payroll and doing the agency's bidding all the time he was employed by the largest labor union in the United States as its international representative in Europe. 2. He served as an advance man for Hubert Humphrey in the 1964 campaign while still working for the CIA. Skipping on down. Wilson offered to take a lie detector test as evidence that he was telling the truth to Jack Anderson about these confessions. The test was being arranged by my associates, Dale Van Atta and Indy Badwar, when Wilson was lured from his Libyan sanctuary, captured in the Dominican Republic, and hustled off to jail in the United States. Skipping on down. His first assignment for the CIA was to provide security for the CIA's super-secret U-2 spy plane in California. He accompanied the U-2 to England, Germany, and finally Turkey, where he served until the Russians shot down Francis Gary Powers. Wilson was then transferred to the CIA's International Organizations Division. Okay, a couple of things here. Let's take them in order. First of all, again, the idea that Wilson's testimony could be an embarrassment to the United States, especially if he had witnesses to back it up. You will remember that in his request for witnesses, one of them was Lane Kirkland, at that time, still at this time, currently the head of the AFL-CIO. Wilson was on the CIA's payroll, he claims, and doing the agency's bidding, while working for the AFL-CIO in Europe. And of course, the AFL-CIO was acting as a front in this case to disrupt European communism. Also, the Hubert Humphrey advance man thing, which is certainly something that should raise an eyebrow. A CIA officer working in a Democratic campaign in 1964.
Recall that Billy Carter, brother of Democratic President Jimmy Carter, was also involved with Terpil and Wilson in some capacity in their Libyan deals.
Absolutely. Skipping on down, it's also interesting to note that Wilson had offered to take a lie detector test, and the test was being set up, and during the time and before that test was actually taken by him for a well-known reporter, in this case Jack Anderson, was when the government finally cracked the whip on him and closed the circle and dragged him in and arrested him after waiting some 5 or 6 years to do it, as we've heard earlier. Okay, last, but perhaps most important, is the fact that Ed Wilson's first assignment for the CIA was to provide security for the super-secret U-2 spy plane. Okay, those of you, to try and make a long story very short, those of you who listen to the Guns of November will remember that we started off our entire investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy with a look at the Cold War years. We talked about the fact that a summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was destroyed utterly by the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane, and that there were certain elements within the government at that time who thought that any kind of a move towards a summit was a terrible thing to do and probably would have been quite happy to see it called off. We also talked about Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher Prouty, a former liaison officer between the Air Force Intelligence and the CIA, who in his book characterized this government within a government as the secret team, and suggested that perhaps indeed that the U-2 incident was in fact sabotaged by the CIA or elements thereof so as to prevent the selfsame summit. Interesting to find Ed Wilson then working to provide security for the U-2 spy plane and being transferred immediately after the Russians, or not immediately perhaps, but right after the Russians shot down Francis Gary Powers, thus queering the summit for good. Last but not least, we talked about the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, during his time in the Marine Corps, in which time many people have suggested that he was in fact working for U.S. intelligence, was working out of the Atsugi Naval Air Base, at which point he was, in fact, in contact with and perhaps working with that self-same U-2 spy plane network. And, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald later showed up in rather more spectacular circumstances as being what some people, myself included, feel was the position of a patsy in the John F. Kennedy assassination. And whatever his position was, it was definitely not what we have been led to believe it was by the Warren Commission. So, again, rather interesting connection, a rather interesting place for Ed Wilson to find himself back in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
And keep in mind that he was transferred from the U-2 security project right after Powers went down. Now, Prouty, who was Air Force focal point officer and in charge of all CIA operations involving Air Force units, had indicated in his book, The Secret Team, that it was almost impossible for the U-2 plane to have been brought down without inside assistance from the secret team, due to the fact that not only was the lack of fuel an unlikely cause, as some suggested that Powers may have been running out of fuel, but he said apparently with the U-2 you can easily see by the wings and the droop of the wings whether or not the plane is fully fueled. But in addition to that, Francis Gary Powers was not sanitized in any of the ways in which a U-2 pilot was normally sanitized. He had all kinds of hard identification on him, linking him with the U.S. military and intelligence establishments. And in addition to that, the U-2 plane flew so high that there were no aircraft or missiles of that time that were capable of bringing it down. So Edwin Wilson is in charge of the security for the U-2, which turned out to be very insecure indeed prior to Francis Gary Powers going down. And as soon as Powers goes down, Wilson is off to greener climes.
And again, not to get too complicated with this, but one of the other things that we also talked about during the Guns of November was the fact that one of the main things that sent John F. Kennedy into a rage and made him threaten to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces was the Bay of Pigs. Again, not to get too complicated, but Fletcher Prouty also suggested some perhaps internal meddling with the Bay of Pigs operation, which is kind of complicated to get into right now. But interestingly enough, of course, as we have heard to an extent earlier in this broadcast, Ed Wilson was probably the chief, or certainly one of the chief paymasters of the Bay of Pigs operation as well.
Okay, going back to the book Libyan Sandstorm by John K. Cooley, from which Nip Tuck read you a section earlier, about Edwin Wilson's background. Among the operations he was involved in before he turned his interest to North Africa was the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained Cuban mercenaries in 1960. Wilson handled procurement of equipment and pay for the invasion force. In that operation, he worked with Theodore G. Shackley, S-H-A-C-K-L-E-Y, one of the key officials in the CIA's clandestine service. According to evidence unearthed by Seymour Hersh, Shackley was of great help to Wilson and Terpil later with their Libyan operations for Gaddafi. Okay, so Edwin Wilson basically was, for all intents and purposes, the Bay of Pigs paymaster. He handled procurement of equipment and pay for the invasion force. And keep in mind that Fletcher Prouty, again, Air Force focal point officer, testifies that sabotaging of the air cover for the Bay of Pigs invasion was responsible for its failure, not any action or lack of action on the part of John F. Kennedy. Now, of course, the Cuban exile community has held Kennedy responsible for the Bay of Pigs failure, and anti-Castro Cubans do figure in the cabal that was involved in assassinating John F. Kennedy. And a key figure in, according to Prouty, in the sabotaging of Bay of Pigs, and as well it is, and also in the organized crime